of careful calibration?
I think this is a pretty major escalation, Alex. There's no question that the U.S. military has a responsibility and a right to protect shipping in the Red Sea. There's a commonly understood right to freedom of navigation, the right of ships to proceed without harassment. And so the idea that you would take military action against Houthi ships that are harassing those container ships and other vessels in the Red Sea, including U.S. military vessels, that's one thing. To go after
October 7th, wondering, and I think I asked John Kirby at the time, what prevents this from becoming an actual war between the U.S. and Iran? And here, not that I'm some sort of Cassandra, but that was the Iranian sort of shadow in all of this has been constant. And I wonder, against the backdrop of South Africa calling Israel to the International Court of Justice for claims of genocide, the degree to which the U.S. is drastically rethinking its relationship to Israel in this war in Gaza.
Well, look, the reality is the longer the Israeli military operation goes on in Gaza, the more there's risk of escalation in various places. We see right now the risk of that escalation in Lebanon, where Hezbollah could be, which has been going tit for tat back and forth with Israel, that risks boiling over into a conflict in which there's essentially a war in Lebanon. You see it in Iraq, where the U.S. has taken military strikes in Baghdad, which we rarely do, because of Iranian-backed militias taking strikes and shots at U.S. military personnel in Syria. So Iraq could boil over. And now you see it in Yemen with this U.S. military action against the Houthis. And look, there's good reason to want to protect shipping in the Red Sea. That is an absolutely valid and necessary objective. At the same time, you're not going to defeat the Houthis militarily with just a few airstrikes. Keep in mind that there was a multi-year war against the Houthis backed by the U.S., I think a mistake in the Obama administration to begin to support the Saudi-led effort to go after the Houthis that did not eliminate the Houthis. So you're not going to eliminate them in 4 airstrikes if several years of a military campaign didn't. And so I think what we're seeing now is just the risks that the longer the war goes on, the longer this goes on in the Middle East, the more one of these pots could boil over, the more that there's a risk to U.S. service members. And the administration is balancing against trying to protect things like freedom of navigation, trying to deter Iranian-backed proxies from doing things to escalate. But at the same time, we're kind of getting drawn in. There's a quicksand component. And I can say this, Alex, as someone who's been in the White House for 8 years, the Middle East has a kind of quicksand component where it can draw you in. And the last thing anybody wants is a full-scale regional war. But unless there's some diplomacy here, that's the momentum that I feel happening right now.
Yeah, well, I mean, and you talk about that. You mentioned the Obama administration with Yemen. Joe Biden was, of course, part of that administration. Joe Biden oversaw the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. He knows. You've been inside these rooms. I mean, this is very much Biden's call. It always is. But given the fact that his defense secretary is not there, can you talk a little bit about how it sort of works in a crisis point like this?
Well, I think it becomes a very White House-centered thing because when you are taking military action that is new, right? I mean, it's one thing when there's a strike against another ISIS target or another Al-Qaeda target, or even in the context of the last several weeks, against a kind of Iranian-backed militia that is harassing our troops in Syria. This is a new thing to go after targets in Yemen, Houthi targets. in Yemen. That crosses a new line, a new legal line, a new military objective, and that ultimately becomes a White House decision, a presidential decision. So I'm sure there have been a flurry of meetings over the course of the last several weeks about how do we stop this harassment of shipping in the Red Sea? How do we stop these attacks on U.S. military vessels in the Red Sea? You have those meetings at various levels, and ultimately it gets continue to go after the Houthis in the Red Sea when we see them, or we can go after them in Yemen. And ultimately that comes to his desk, and the Defense Department is going to carry that out. The Defense Department presents a range of options. Here's what we can do. We can do this in the Red Sea. We can do this in Yemen. You can decide how far to turn that dial. And I think what we see with President Biden today is a degree of frustration with what the Houthis have been doing in the Red Sea, but also a degree in favor of trying to send a message that, hey, back off the shipping in the Red Sea. We mean what we say. You can't do this.
Indeed, the Houthis have said preemptively they are comfortable with a direct confrontation with America. And so we leave it there. Ben Rhodes, my friend, always good to see you. Thank you for your expertise.